Special Collections at the University of Missouri has an unlikely treasure, a manuscript written by Charlotte Bronte when she was only 17 years old. Its small size and tiny handwriting have captivated visitors to the library for over 40 years. Visitors to Special Collections have many questions about the manuscript. Why did Charlotte Bronte write so small? What secrets does the manuscript contain? And how did it come to Mizzou? The story of the manuscript is actually three tales. The story of children growing up in Yorkshire in the 1830s, the story of a faraway kingdom full of adventure and intrigue, and the story of a U.S. senator's surprising discovery and generous gift. The Brontes' home was Haworth Parsonage in Yorkshire. Charlotte Bronte was born in 1816. She was the third daughter of the Reverend Patrick Bronte and his wife Maria, who died in 1821. Maria's sister, Elizabeth Branwell, moved into the parsonage to help with the children's care. Charlotte's older sisters were named Maria after their mother and Elizabeth after their aunt. Her younger siblings were Patrick Branwell, born in 1817, Emily, born in 1818, and Anne, born in 1820. The family called Charlotte's brother by his middle name, Branwell. He painted this portrait of the sisters, and it is now in the National Portrait Gallery in London. He originally included himself between Charlotte and Emily, but later painted himself out. This is the house, Haworth Parsonage, where they lived. Their father, Patrick Bronte, was perpetual curate of Haworth, a life position, and the house came with the job. But the job didn't pay enough for the family to live the genteel lifestyle their social class dictated. As daughters of the resident clergyman, the Bronte sisters would have been socially above most of the other inhabitants of Haworth. However, they couldn't afford most of the amusements that might have been available to them. For the most part, their social life was limited. This is a present-day satellite picture of Haworth, and you can see the Bronte parsonage is circled in yellow. It's next to the church, and it's not far from the town's main street. Haworth was considerably smaller in the 1830s and 1840s when Charlotte was a child. In the 1870s, it was described as consisting chiefly of a steep, narrow street of poor houses, possesses interest as the home and burial place of the novelist Bronte, and has a post office, a railroad station, a church, 4 dissenting chapels, and a grammar school. The Bronte sisters did not go to the grammar school. When Charlotte was 8 years old, she and her 2 older sisters were enrolled at a girls' boarding school, but Charlotte was brought home after her sisters became ill and died there. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne only had sporadic formal education after their deaths, and Branwell was tutored individually by their father. Even without formal schooling, the girls mastered many of the skills expected of young ladies in the 19th century: sewing, drawing, writing, and reading. This slide shows a drawing Charlotte made in 1832. She was a talented artist, but then again, many young girls of this time were expected to be able to draw things like portraits, landscapes, and flowers. These were considered necessary accomplishments for the young women to prepare themselves for one of the 2 options open to them as adults, either marriage or employment as a governess. This aspect of the Brontes' education, therefore, was rather typical. In other ways, the Bronte sisters' education was far from typical. Charlotte and her sisters had access to many publications of the time, including political magazines, newspapers, literary works, and scientific publications. During the 19th century, this type of reading was not considered suitable for young children and was especially frowned upon for girls. However, the only time the girls got into trouble with their father for their reading was when he caught them looking through ladies' magazines, which he thought were full of silly love stories. Patrick Bronte once wrote that he could discuss current events with his children just as easily as he would have with adults. Much of Charlotte's early writing reveals a concern with current politics and world events that goes far beyond her young age. This is the first page from Blackwood's magazine for the first half of 1833, the year Charlotte wrote the 2 stories in the University of Missouri's manuscript. Blackwood's had a mixture of literary and political content. With Mr. Bronte preoccupied with his parish, and Aunt Branwell doing her best to keep the household together on limited funds, the children were often left up to their own devices. All 4 of the children occupied themselves by creating complex imaginary worlds. They called their activities plays. The children had several separate plays happening at the same time, but the one that lasted the longest they called Young Men. It started in June 1826. Charlotte recounted it thus. Papa brought Branwell some wooden soldiers at Leeds. When Papa came home, it was night, and we were in bed, so next morning Branwell came to our door with a box of soldiers. Emily and I jumped out of bed, and I snatched one up and exclaimed, "This is the Duke of Wellington. This shall be the Duke." When I had said this, Emily likewise took one up and said it should be hers. When Anne came down, she said one should be hers. Mine was the prettiest of the whole, and the tallest, and the most perfect in every part. Emily's was a grave-looking fellow, and we called him Gravy. Anne's was a queer little thing, much like herself, and we called him Waiting Boy. Branwell chose his, and we called him Bonaparte. The Young Men's play gave rise to an imaginary colony in Africa called Angria, peopled by the characters represented by the toy soldiers. Although all 4 of the children were involved in the play at first, Emily and Anne soon branched off into their own imaginary kingdoms, leaving Charlotte and Branwell to direct the affairs of Angria by themselves. Charlotte and Branwell documented their plays by producing tiny magazines they called the Young Men's magazines. Many are the size you see here, and this is actually a manuscript that was recently purchased by the Howard's Parsonage Museum as a result of a crowdfunding campaign. It is unknown why the Bronte children chose to write their stories in such tiny script, but several suggestions have been made. One is that the children may have been trying to hide their imaginative plays. If secrecy was the motivation, Charlotte and Branwell were probably successful. Most people cannot read the manuscripts without a magnifying glass, and even then, it's difficult to decipher. Another possible explanation is that the children wrote to the scale of the toy soldiers that played such an important role in their imaginary world. They wrote the manuscripts for the soldiers. In essence, they were creating their own toys. One of Charlotte's school friends recalled that when she asked Charlotte about her tiny handwriting, Charlotte responded that she and Branwell had learned to print so small by writing in their magazine. They brought out a magazine once a month and wished it to look as much like print as possible. The magazine Charlotte's friend referred to was likely Branwell's Young Men's magazine. Sometimes they also called it Blackwood's Young Men's magazine, and they published it as a chronicle of monthly events and notices concerning the Young Men's play. Charlotte, at first uninvolved in the production of the manuscript, became its principal editor in 1830. Scholars have pieced together a general idea of the Angrian saga from the Young Men's magazines. However, not all of them survive, and there are still holes in the storyline. The first Angrian tale that Charlotte and Branwell wrote documents the beginnings of the kingdom. 12 of Charlotte's personal heroes, including the Duke of Wellington, her perennial favorite, are shipwrecked off the coast of Africa. With the help of magic, they found a city called Verdopolis. The town quickly grows to become one of the preeminent cities of the world, and the Duke of Wellington becomes its king. Eventually, the town creates colonies, which become provinces, ruled democratically from Verdopolis. All is peaceful until the Duke of Wellington's son, variously called the Marquis of Douro, the Duke of Zamorna, and Arthur Wellesley, tries to take over 3 of the provinces, calls them the Kingdom of Angria, and proclaims himself ruler. Charlotte was fascinated with Arthur Wellesley, and he appears as a main character in many of the stories she created. This is an illustration of him, which she created while in her teens or early 20s. Magic permeates the early stories, but by the later stories, Charlotte and Branwell were more interested in politics and romance, leaving the world of fairy tales behind. Although Branwell introduced the idea of revolution and came up with the Kingdom of Angria, Charlotte eventually became the dominant creative force behind the play. She developed complex, interconnected plots that drew on the often stormy relationships between several main characters. These plots were also strongly influenced by recent events in the political world, as well as by Charlotte's current choice of reading material. The manuscript in special collections contains 2 stories of Angria, one of which features Arthur Wellesley as a main character. The title page states that the story is by Charles Wellesley, his younger brother, and the story is told from his point of view. The manuscript is dated November 27th, 1833, and the place of writing is given as Verdopolis. The first story, The Secret, is a tale of lies, infants switched at birth, and political intrigue involving the wife of the Marquis of Douro, Marion Hume. The second story, Lily Hart, is unconnected to the main characters and storylines that drive the Angrian saga. It involves a rags-to-riches story that ends with the title character, a poor and virtuous young girl, being married to a prince of one of the Angrian colonies. Full transcriptions of both the stories have been published, and you can check that book out from Ellis Library or the Columbia Public Library. As you can see, the handwriting in this manuscript is just as small as it is in the Young Men's magazines, but the page size is actually much larger. The manuscript measures about 4.5 by 5 inches. By the time she was 17, Charlotte was writing stories that stood independent of the Young Men's magazine and her plays with Branwell. She was beginning to think of herself as a serious writer. Of course, Charlotte and her sisters would all go on to become published authors. Special Collections also has a first American edition of their first ever publication, a volume of poems the sisters published under the pseudonyms Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. Still writing as the Bells, Charlotte published Jane Eyre in 1847. Anne and Emily each also published novels in December of that year. All 3 of the novels met with success. The future seemed bright for the young family of authors. Tragedy, however, soon overtook the Bronte family. Branwell, who had struggled with drug addiction for years, died suddenly of tuberculosis in September 1848 at the age of 31. Emily died 2 months later in December. Anne contracted the disease as well and died the following May. Charlotte nursed them all through their illnesses and remained at the parsonage to care for her aging father. Charlotte eventually resumed writing, and she published 2 more novels during her lifetime. In 1854, she married her father's curate, Arthur Bell Nichols. She died only 6 months after the marriage, either from pregnancy complications or from typhus. She was 39. The manuscript's voyage from the Yorkshire moors to the American heartland took 120 years. For a time, all of Charlotte's childhood toys and other writings remained in her father's house. After Charlotte's death, her husband Arthur Nichols stayed at Haworth and took care of Patrick Bronte for 7 years, until he passed away in 1861. After that, Nichols went back to Ireland, where he had grown up. He took Charlotte's books, papers, and personal items with him, intent on preserving her memory. The manuscript went with him. It was first documented by Elizabeth Gaskell, Charlotte's biographer, who probably saw it just after Charlotte's death. This shows the first page of The Secret, reproduced in Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Bronte, which was first published in 1857. The collector and author Clement Shorter purchased the manuscript from Nichols, along with many other pieces of Bronte juvenilia in 1895. The manuscript is mentioned in Shorter's book The Brontes, Life and Letters, which was published in 1908. At some point, The juvenilia were purchased by Shorter, passed to book dealer Thomas Wise, who sold them piece by piece as literary curiosities. This particular manuscript was sold in New York around 1915. It was not seen again by scholars for nearly 60 years. In 1972, Evelyn Wadsworth Symington, the wife of Missouri's U.S. Senator Stuart Symington, passed away. As the family went through her books and papers, they discovered a curious box, made to look like a book. It was marked, "C. Bronte, The Secret," on the spine. On opening it, they discovered this very manuscript, which had been presumed by some scholars to be lost or destroyed in one of the world wars. Mrs. Symington was known to collect books, but no one knew how, when, or where she had acquired this little booklet. The senator and his son, Congressman James W. Symington, presented the manuscript to the University of Missouri Libraries in 1975. The Symingtons wrote that they donated it that it may not only enhance the library of your great university, but serve as an inspiration to young scholars. The manuscript has been at the University of Missouri ever since. Although Charlotte had carefully sewn it into a pamphlet, the little booklet had come apart into separate pages by the time it was digitized in 2002. After librarians noticed that the edges were flaking in 2005, it was encased in an inert plastic called mylar for preservation. It's not laminated. We can open the plastic any time and take out the manuscript without damage, but this enclosure allows people to handle it, while at the same time preserving it for future generations. It is stored in a temperature and humidity-controlled vault, behind locked doors and alarms, safeguarded as one of the cultural treasures that belong to the people of Missouri and to the world. To page through the manuscript yourself, go to the University of Missouri Digital Library. It's there in its entirety, freely available to all.